Calorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents When Left Moves Right, The Decline of the Left and the Rise of the Populist Right in Postcommunist Europe, by Maria Snegovaya. Read by Teri Schnaubelt. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures, tables, and appendices present in the print and ebook formats of the book. What happens when left moves right? The puzzle. When historians look back on Europe in the early 21st century, they will look first at the seemingly miraculous rise of the populist right. Over the past 2 decades, the number of right-wing parties in Europe almost doubled, while support for them more than tripled. Populist right parties gained enough votes to put their leaders into government positions in 11 European countries. Right-wing populism is particularly strong and pervasive in Eastern Europe. Populist right parties often outcompete mainstream parties there and have come to power in Hungary and Poland. Since 2000, when Eastern European populist parties took an average of 9.2% of the national vote, their vote share has tripled, reaching 31.6% in 2017. In some Eastern European countries, right-wing populism has become so pervasive that the main competitors to populist governments are themselves right-wing populists. For example, in Hungary, the populist right Jobbik Magyarországért Mozgalom Jobbik party grew to become the main challenger of the populist right Fidesz Magyar Polgári Szövetség Fidesz party. Right-wing populist leaders often embrace and promote xenophobic stances and socially conservative values, and when in power implement illiberal reforms, which undermine institutional checks and dismantle the key cornerstones of democracy. The implications of this phenomenon for the resilience of democracy in the region are therefore tremendous. What explains the dramatic rise of such parties? My book offers a new theory. The story of communist successor parties in post-communist Europe presents an interesting conundrum. Throughout the 1990s, many leftist parties in Central and Eastern Europe defied predictions that they would sink into oblivion after democratic transition by winning elections all over the region. One popular explanation of leftist parties' electoral success in the early 1990s focused on their ability to rebrand, embrace social democratic platforms, and actively promote accession to the European Union in their countries. But if this were the case, what explains their sudden change of fate a decade later, when the left's popularity plummeted all over the region, even though most of these parties had not changed their politics since the rebranding took place? Starting in the mid-2000s, left-wing parties began to suffer major electoral defeats in the very countries that had so enthusiastically supported them just a decade before. And there were no newly reconstituted left-wing parties to replace them. They simply disappeared. Meanwhile, right-wing populist parties gained traction, particularly with the working class, a traditional constituency of the left. Electoral politics in the region had flipped. What happened? And were these two political dynamics connected? These processes in post-communist countries also had direct parallels in Western Europe. In recent years, socialist and social democratic parties on the left have declined dramatically in many Western European countries as well. In France and the Netherlands, they have disappeared almost entirely from the political scene. Even in former social democratic strongholds, such as Germany and Scandinavia, the left's vote shares saw a striking drop in the 21st century. By the mid-2010s, the share of votes for social democratic and socialist parties in Western Europe was at its lowest in 70 years. And the situation closely resembled that of post-communist Europe. As left-wing parties declined, the populist right came to power. Figure I.1, which can be found in the print and ebook versions of this book. Meanwhile, over the past 2 decades, right-wing populist parties made important inroads across Italy, Germany, Spain, Sweden, and Belgium, and have dominated the polls in countries such as France and the United Kingdom. The number of Europeans voting for populist parties in national elections has surged from an average of 7% in 1998 to more than 25% in 2018. In the 2019 European Parliament election, the populist right received 161 seats, 23%, compared to 118, 17%, back in 2014. Given the region-wide nature of this phenomenon, rather than theorizing post-communist polities as a unique post-communist anomaly, this book offers a coherent theoretical framework that explains the dynamism of right-wing populism in post-communist countries by drawing from the literature on Western Europe and by demonstrating parallels in party system dynamics across Europe. My book merges the studies of left-wing and populist right parties to demonstrate that the decay of the left and the rise of the populist right are indeed interconnected. Existing scholarship has tended to explore these two phenomena separately, but this book demonstrates that specific policy choices made by parties on the left created opportunities for right-wing populist parties to appeal to the socioeconomic groups that had previously supported the left. First, I argue that the embrace of pro-market policies and the implementation of painful and unpopular reforms contributed to the electoral demise of left-wing parties in the region. At the time of implementation, these programmatic transformations seemed like the only way for left-wing parties to sway the democratic electorate after losing the support of communist-era patronage networks and the influence of populist leaders. Instead, they ended up containing the seeds for the decay of these parties. By accepting and promoting pro-market, neoliberal policies at the beginning of the transition, leftist parties gradually pushed away their traditional electorates. By embracing reforms, the ex-communist left ended up discrediting themselves in the eyes of the very constituencies whose interests they had pledged to defend. Second, I argue that the populist parties on the right turned out to be unlikely beneficiaries of the left's policy miscalculations. In the aftermath of the EU accession, the reforms-induced frustration with the pro-market left created a political opening for populist parties. Former electorates of left parties, at that point apathetic, frustrated, or abstaining from voting for the left, became available for mobilization by right-wing parties. These parties appealed to the economically vulnerable voters from working-class backgrounds who had made up the bulk of the left's electorate. They did so by adopting traditionally left-wing positions on economic issues while maintaining their nativist stances on cultural issues. As a result of this dynamic, the pro-market successor leftist parties lost substantive swaths of their core electorates, who were disappointed by the left's inability to represent their interests. My book traces these dynamics within the party systems of select post-communist countries. I demonstrate that the decline of the center-left and the rise of right-wing populism ultimately resulted from the same process: economically vulnerable voters shifting away from the left to embrace the populist right. While the availability of large swaths of former electorates of left parties, particularly working classes, created a precondition for the rise of populist parties, much depended on populists' own strategies. Populism and its rise across Europe remains a multi-causal phenomenon. Beyond economically redistributionist positions, populist parties also exploited socially conservative issues such as anti-immigration sentiments, fears of sexual minorities, and other forms of cultural revanchism spreading across the region to attract support. Yet why did the messages spread by populist right-wing parties work in some contexts but failed in others? This book helps answer that question. The unintended consequences. After communism collapsed, ex-communist parties all over Central and Eastern Europe had to choose between two possible strategies as they navigated the challenges of their country's emerging market economies. They could either preserve their ideological Marxist orthodoxy and the redistributionist economic platform, or shift to the center of the ideological spectrum by implementing pro-market reforms. Communist successor parties overwhelmingly viewed the latter strategy as more electorally advantageous. Implementing pro-market reforms allowed them to demonstrate their disassociation from communism while expressing their commitment to the principles and ideals of democracy and the market economy. Embracing pro-market reforms seemed like a great idea. Many observers assumed that left-wing parties were in relatively good position to implement harsh austerity measures and privatize state-owned enterprises, since they could not be so hurt by the political consequences of such measures. By this logic, the case of Poland and Hungary, whose ex-communist parties turned out to be more effective reformers than their right-wing predecessors, seemed exemplary. They were touted by politicians and scholars alike as models to be emulated by other countries in the region. For instance, in 2002, Gizmala Buse wrote that the Hungarian Socialist Party and the Social Democracy Party of Poland have not only dramatically turned around their appeals, but have done so with remarkable success. Both have successfully pursued broad electorates with their appeals for a continuation of reform, but with greater sensitivity and competence. Such statements were primarily based on the expectations of voter loyalty. Scholars did not expect policy reversals to constitute a major threat to the stability of left-wing parties' electoral base for three reasons. First, left-wing parties in the region were able to build considerably stronger and more extensive organizations than their right-wing competitors, partly as a legacy of the communist period. This allowed them to insulate supporters from the appeals of opponents and maintain voters during major policy reversals. Strong organization, such as widespread local presence, sizable membership that helped reach and appeal to voters on a personal level, and professional management provided leftist parties with an advantage over their rightist competitors in grassroots campaigns, which was crucial for maintaining the support of old adherents. Note: strong party organization often turned out to be a consequence rather than a reason for ex-communist parties' electoral success. Empirical indicators of parties' organizational decline, such as changes in party membership, tended to follow rather than precede the popularity decline of the ex-communist left parties. Therefore, in statistical terms, the decline in organizational strength appears to be a symptom of ex-communist leftist party failure rather than its cause. Early on, those left-wing parties that would prove to be successful in the long term managed to forge strong institutionalized links with the trade unions of the communist era. These ties further reinforced their support bases. Second, the traditional pro-welfare image of leftist parties was expected to provide a safeguard against voter punishment because budget cuts introduced by left-wing parties, unlike those introduced by right-wing parties, could be interpreted as being absolutely essential rather than ideologically motivated. At the time, this perspective seemed to find empirical backing. Studies of Western Europe had discovered that economic policy reversals, such as dismantling the welfare state, were better accepted by the public if pursued by left-wing parties. Third, scholars expected that the existence of lingering social constituencies, older people, former members of communist parties, etc., would facilitate the programmatic turnaround of successor parties. Because of hostility toward anyone associated with the previous regime in the early post-transition years, voters of ex-communist leftist parties often viewed them as the only potential protectors of their interests, and were therefore willing to tolerate major policy shifts for the sake of their survival and electoral success. 2 decades later, it has become clear that experts overestimated the level of loyalty for the reformist left. This book argues that the electoral gains made in the 1990s ultimately came at the expense of the left's electoral success in the subsequent decade. Shifting to the center of the economic policy dimension watered down the left's distinctive historical profile and eventually rendered the left unable to take advantage of the widespread discontent over the fallout from neoliberal reforms. After tolerating pro-market rebranding by successor parties for several electoral rounds, supporters abandoned these parties, which led to their subsequent decay. Linking supply and demand. There are generally two types of explanations for party system dynamics: demand side and supply side. Demand side explanations focus on individual level reasons why people choose to support specific parties. For example, popular sentiments like anti-Romaniism and levels of nationalism or nativism, exacerbated by external triggers such as immigration and globalization, are demand-side explanations for why some voters may support right-wing populist parties. Studies have shown a positive correlation between anti-immigrant attitudes and populist right support. Demand-side studies also explain the rise of populism through macro-level economic variables, such as high unemployment, exogenous variation in import flows, or a lack of social compensation against market volatility and economic globalization. But demand-side approaches have a fundamental problem when it comes to explaining the popularity of populist parties in Europe. While the average levels of nationalism and xenophobia have tended to remain stable in these countries, the vote shares for these parties have fluctuated dramatically. To take one example, perceived threats from Roma minorities have commonly been used as explanations for the growth of populist right parties in the post-communist region. But throughout the observed period, average levels of the anti-Roma sentiment were much lower in both Poland and Hungary, countries where right-wing populist parties came to power, than in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, countries where right-wing populist parties had relatively low success. In other words, the dynamic was the opposite of what demand-side explanations would predict. Similarly, the cross-national correlation between levels of racist or anti-immigrant sentiment and the success of right-wing populists is inconclusive. For example, despite extremely low levels of racism and anti-immigrant views in Sweden, the right-wing Sweden Democrats became the country's third-largest party. Anti-immigration attitudes and immigration levels are, generally speaking, not a necessary condition of voting for the populist right. Thus, Watlamanati and Kelly, using panel data on 27 OECD countries from 1990 to 2014, found no direct effect of refugee flows in explaining electoral support for populist right parties. Roberts found a statistically significant negative relationship between the level of immigration and the right-wing populist vote share. And while the popularity of populist right parties grew in recent decades, racist and anti-immigrant sentiments have actually declined in Europe and the United States over the same period. Therefore, one can conclude that immigration objectives figures are not by themselves sufficient to grasp the impact of the phenomenon on populist voters' reaction. This, as well as further evidence presented in this book, suggests that demand-side explanations alone are not sufficient to account for the phenomenon in question. Any attempts to explain the decay of the left and the rise of the populist right should incorporate an analysis of the supply side, that is, the opportunity structures that parties use. Supply-side explanations focus on ways in which parties change their rhetoric and programmatic agendas to capitalize on demand-side opportunities and entrench themselves in their respective systems. Under this logic, increasing the salience or higher relevance of citizens' voting decisions of xenophobic, racist, and/or anti-immigrant feelings, rather than their absolute levels in a given society, may be what influences growing support for populists. Politicians and parties are a common factor shaping the growth of salience of specific issues. Successful politicians structure the world so they can win by emphasizing the issues that benefit them and their party and sidelining those which do not. However, even when populist parties use platforms politicizing immigration, identity, and/or religion, their successes can vary tremendously, depending on the political context. What explains this variation? Whether or not populist right parties succeed is highly dependent on the strategic choices of mainstream parties as they open up the political space for populist appeals. Mainstream parties' failures to respond to the concerns and grievances of the electorate and to articulate clear and convincing policy alternatives made populists an attractive option for many voters. With regard to this book's argument, the coalescence of mainstream parties around neoliberal reforms driven by leftist parties' rebranding allowed populist parties an opportunity to credibly claim that these projects have ignored the needs of the people while simultaneously impoverishing and exploiting them. As such, populism may be viewed as a distinctive vehicle by which wider disenfranchised populations are laboring to make sense of their experiences and discontents about the post-political neoliberal globalized environment. In addition, the convergence of mainstream parties around the neoliberal consensus opened up more opportunities for right-wing populists to place a stronger emphasis on the cultural grievances of their electorates. This increased the salience of the socio-cultural dimension. This book connects the supply and demand side explanations by analyzing reasons and consequences for specific economic policy choices adopted by center-left parties. It tracks how the choices on the supply side interacted with voter behavior on the demand side, specifically by adopting policies that differed from the preferences of their traditional working-class electorates. Reformist left parties opened up new opportunities for right-wing populist parties. Terms and definitions. Several terms in this book warrant additional attention to ensure their meanings are accurately interpreted. For the purpose of my argument, I introduce the concept of party competition and describe the political space in which parties operate. Party competition is a strategic contest among parties as political actors to gain political power by positioning themselves on different policy dimensions. Policy dimensions refer to a particular type of conflict in democratic systems that is created by social structural transformations such as nation building, industrialization, marketization, and post-industrialization. Studies have demonstrated that party competition in Western Europe unfolded primarily along two dimensions, an economic axis and a socio-cultural axis. The economic dimension refers to a conflict about levels of economic regulation and redistribution that occurs between supporters of more stringent socialist and capitalist policies. The socio-cultural dimension usually describes a conflict that occurs between supporters of more traditional and more multicultural post-materialist values and issues. This conflict emerges when social groups, often older and less educated, feel threatened by the increasing cultural diversity in their countries and seek to defend their traditional ways of life from other ethnic or racial groups. Conventional left-wing parties stand for stronger market regulation and wealth redistribution on the economic axis, but generally oppose nationalist projects on the socio-cultural axis. De-alignment is when a large swath of voters leaves their party without switching to another. Realignment is when a large swath of voters switches to another party. These processes typically occur when voter preferences on one of these two dimensions change, or when voters perceive that their political party no longer represents their preferred policies. Following the collapse of communism, countries underwent the process of a triple transition. Political transition refers to democratization, transitioning from autocratic to democratic political systems. The process of national transition led to defining the territorial and cultural boundaries of the nation-state in respective societies. Ultimately, economic transition refers to marketization, a transition away from the command economies of the communist era to the market economies of post-communist Europe. Marketization in post-communist Europe launched the formation of a socio-economic cleavage between the economic reform winners and losers. The concept of cleavage implies the existence of a common set of values and attitudes among various social groups that are converted into their voting choices. The reforms induced radical disruption of voters' incomes, lifestyles, and futures, provided the impetus for the conversion of divisions in political preferences along socio-economic lines. Across the groups that found themselves on winning and losing sides of the transition, economic liberalization launched the struggle surrounding differences over the economy, distribution of resources, state versus private property, collective versus individualist strategies for economic advancement, the role of the state in redistributing income, merit versus need-based conceptions of justice, and so on. For party competition at the elite level, the positioning of reform winners against losers was often divided along party lines. The group of winners usually includes highly educated employees who took on a growing number of specialized service jobs requiring expertise, as well as the young and those employed by the private sector. By contrast, reform losers refer to a broader group of individuals who have been harmed by the unprecedented economic transition and global market integration across the former communist states. They include various groups disadvantaged in terms of income and upward mobility. These are individuals who are unemployed or disproportionately exposed to income cuts, older and less educated, retirees, rural residents, and state workers. Different social classes found themselves on winning and losing sides of transition. For the purposes of this book, social class is conceptualized as an interrelated set of occupational characteristics which give rise to differentiated economic strategies and link workers from various sectors of the economy. Note, those characteristics are contingently related to others, such as social status or income, but are not defined by them. Defined as such, class positions are allocated using occupational titles and an established algorithm for popular class schemas like Goldthorpe, Erickson-Goldthorpe classes, or ISH classification schema. Following the market transition, working-class groups or blue-collar workers, employed as the clerks, and service and production workers were among the groups badly hit by the transition-induced erosion of communist factory-based jobs and were at a greater disadvantage in terms of income and upward mobility. Note, in this book, I use the terms production workers, working class, blue-collar worker, and manual worker as interchangeable to denote a working-class person performing non-agricultural manual labor. Bain and Prince enumerate the characteristics pertaining to white-collar as opposed to blue-collar work, such as intellectual as opposed to manual activities, differing functions, administration, design, analysis and planning, etc., versus actual production, as opposed to routine, proximity to authority. These divisions were further exacerbated by structural changes associated with the integration of post-communist economies into international markets. It was often difficult for these social groups to articulate their dissatisfaction along anti-capitalist lines, making them easy targets for populist appeals and more likely to join the electorates of populist parties. The bulk of this book focuses on the process of economic transition in post-communist Europe and the effects of this process on the institutionalization of post-communist party systems. I use the terms neoliberalism, neoliberal policies, and pro-market reforms interchangeably to refer to the embrace of three elements: economic privatization, deregulation and liberalization, and work-centric welfare reforms. The term neoliberal is often poorly understood, particularly in the American context, where the center-left Democratic Party has traditionally been considered liberal. Conversely, this book's focus is primarily on economic liberalism, neoliberalism, derived from the continental European conception of liberalism, that is, 19th century or classical liberalism. By the 1990s, neoliberal had come to refer to a set of policies designed to promote market competition viewed as the best solution for all kinds of economic problems and as both the means and the ends of good government. Neoliberalism came to be translated into a specific reforms package that included the liberalization of trade in goods and capital, the privatization of state institutions and industries, the depoliticization of decision-making on economic and monetary policies, and the separation of regulatory authorities from the executive branch. The first stage of reforms included the Washington Consensus policies of structural adjustment. The second stage of reforms included pension privatization, the flat tax, and the slashing of corporate tax rates. During the 1990s and 2000s, post-communist countries became global leaders in the adoption of neoliberal ideas and policies at a dramatic rate. They also became some of the most open economies in Europe. Note: in the post-communist context, the terms neoliberalism and pro-market reforms are often used as synonyms, as they were part of the same.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?